In this course, we have traced the history of human rights by focusing on certain key events, ideas, and personalities that have shaped human rights. We began with the exploration of the conceptual and theoretical debates about the meaning of human rights, the debates about the universalism and cultural relativism of human rights, the debates about the prioritization of human rights, and the conflict between human rights principles. We examined the positions of various scholars in relation to the origins of human rights. We then explored early religious and ethical influences on human rights and the contributions of classical and Enlightenment thought to the development of the human rights idea, as well as the impact of anti-slavery and abolitionist movements on human rights. We explored the intersection between industrial capitalism and socialism in the human rights movement and the impact of the world wars and the struggle for rights to self-determination by colonized people on the expansion of human rights. We examined the structure of the international human rights systems and the politicization of human rights during the Cold War. We examined minority rights through the lens of the rights of indigenous people and the emerging struggles by LGBTQ people for human rights inclusion. Finally, we explored the current trends in the evolution of human rights, such as globalization, mass migration, and the war on terrorism and their impact on human rights norms and conditions. In this concluding class, we will examine some of the general patterns in human rights history. Historians usually limit their research and analysis to the past. We typically do not concern ourselves with the future or make future predictions. But in this final class, we will look into the future of human rights. Given what we know about the history of human rights, what does the future hold for human rights as a principle and as a condition? There are two main patterns that have emerged in our study of the global history of human rights in this class. The first pattern is that the historical development of human rights has not followed a linear or consistently progressive pattern. Human rights history is not a story of the steady progress of rights ideas from ancient times to the present day. It is true that the history of human rights is defined by sporadic advances in human rights ideas, principles, and conditions. However, human rights history is also defined by frequent setbacks, paradoxes, and contradictions. The history of human rights is not one of unremitting progress towards one or several utopias. It is a more complex record of competing visions of rights. Global human rights histories are therefore stories of rights inclusion, but they are also stories of rights exclusion and the struggles of those excluded to be included in rights protection. As we have seen throughout this course, ideas such as the Enlightenment and Enlightenment liberalism and key events such as the French and American revolutions certainly marked rights advances. But these rights did not extend equally to everyone. Also, human rights are sometimes selectively interpreted, not to protect the rights of everyone, but to suit the interests of certain individuals, communities, or countries. For example, we saw that during the Cold War, human rights discourse was politicized to serve strategic, national, geopolitical, and ideological agendas. Human rights history is a paradoxical history of exclusion and struggles for rights inclusion. It is a story of tensions and contradictions. It is a story of Christian humanism and secular liberalism implicated in the cultural dispossession of indigenous people. It is a story of emancipatory anti-slavery forces that also legitimized colonial subjugation. It is a story of wartime anti-Nazi rhetoric, of freedom that rejected self-determination for colonized peoples. It is a story of the tensions between collective solidarity rights and individual-centered civil liberties. We have seen in this course that ideas and movements for rights inclusion have historically been confronted with counter-movements by dominant groups to prevent the expansion of rights benefits and protections to those considered outsiders. This makes the history of human rights more a narrative of tensions and paradoxes than one of certainty and progress. The second pattern that emerges from our study of human rights history is that the post-Second World War vision of universal human rights, outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights instruments, and in several regional and national human rights documents, remains largely unfulfilled. The goal of the international community to prevent mass atrocities and genocide in the aftermath of the Holocaust has not been achieved. Since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which optimistically affirms the rights of all humans, human rights violations continue around the world. Since the Holocaust, the world has witnessed several mass atrocities and genocides, notably the Cambodian genocide and the Rwandan genocide, both of which we've studied in this course. So does this mean that the human rights revolution has failed? It depends on who you ask. Scholars are divided in their assessment of the state of human rights. There are optimistic and pessimistic views on the state of human rights. First, let's consider the pessimistic view. Some scholars are deeply skeptical about human rights, believing that cultural and political differences in our world make the notion of universal human rights a utopian and unattainable goal. Some critics argue that human rights norms have not delivered greater justice but have become part of the problem in human society. They argue that the individualistic focus of international human rights has taken attention away from structural issues like poverty and global economic inequality. Pessimists also point out that human rights principles continue to be undermined by present-day realities, such as tyrannical governments in third world countries that violate citizen rights, wars and conflicts in which international humanitarian law is disregarded, the proliferation of religious fundamentalism and terrorism, the emergence of neo-nationalist and anti-democratic forces in many countries, the revival of xenophobia and anti-immigration policies in many affluent Western countries, the rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and homophobia, and all these, they suggest, point to the reversal in the gains of human rights in the past few decades. Some skeptical scholars and activists therefore reject the human rights framework and call for a new, more transformative social justice project. Let us now consider the optimistic view of human rights. Optimists argue that despite obvious limitations, the world has witnessed substantive improvements in human rights awareness and conditions since antiquity, but especially since the establishment of the international human rights system in the mid-20th century. Optimists argue that the international human rights law marks a breakthrough in global politics. More people around the world are now conscious of their rights and have the tools within their reach to fight for these rights. Even if governments do not always fulfill their human rights obligations to citizens, they can now be more easily held accountable for human rights violations by non-governmental organizations and by international judicial institutions such as the International Criminal Court. One scholar describes this positive trend in international human rights enforcement as the justice cascade. So, what does the future hold for human rights? As international human rights guarantees expand to include more marginalized groups, the list of human rights continues to grow. New human rights have been recognized through the signing of new international treaties as well as through domestic legal and policy reforms. For example, there is the emergent notion of the right to truth, which the United Nations defines as the right of the public and individuals to know the truth about gross human rights abuses and serious violations of international humanitarian law. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union includes several new human rights that were not envisioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or even in early United Nations human rights covenants. These include the right to protection of personal data, the right to protection of linguistic diversity, the freedom of the arts and sciences, and even the right to good administration. The European Charter also includes provision to protect the rights of the elderly to lead a life of dignity and independence. In some countries, the debate over the right to human dignity has extended to voluntary euthanasia or the right to die, which is founded on the belief that just as a human being is entitled to the right to life, they should also be entitled to the right to end their own life. The question is whether these interpretations take the notion of human rights and human rights principles too far. In addition, there have been calls to extend human rights principles to non-human rights. Rights traditionally reserved for humans have extended to include non-human entities such as corporations, animals, and the natural environment. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to establish what it called the rights of nature in its national constitution. This constitutional provision protects the inalienable rights of ecosystems. It gives people the authority to bring legal petitions on behalf of nature and ecosystems and requires the government to remedy violations of rights against nature. These new rights of nature marks a major expansion of the scope of traditional human rights. Again, the question the scholars ask is whether these promising innovations in human rights discourse takes the notion of human rights and takes human rights principles too far. There is some reason for hope and optimism that the 21st century will be a period of consolidating the human rights advances of the last century rather than a period of reversal of these gains. Despite the historic and contemporary human rights violations that we have studied in this course, I think it is fair to say that there is indeed an emerging global consensus on universal human rights. Many people are now conscious of their rights and the need to uphold universal human rights principles. Governments and political leaders are now also more conscious of human rights, even if this consciousness does not always translate into policies and actions. Human rights organizations increasingly play important roles in holding governments and non-state actors accountable for human rights violations, both within their borders and beyond their borders. While the debate over the universality and cultural relativism of human rights will continue, many people around the world believe that universal human rights can be promoted within a framework that allows for cross-cultural understanding. It is with this hope in the future of human rights that we end this course.